Welcome to Stamford, once described as the most elegant town on the Great North Road, and today known as the finest stone town in Britain. Having once existed as one of the country's largest, wealthiest and most influential towns of all, the streets of this South Lincolnshire market town appear to have frozen in time back in the 18th century, as Stamford today is filled to the brim with a staggeringly complete collection of beautiful historic stone buildings, set beside fetching riverside scenery, here in England's East Midlands. Beginning here on the busy town bridge, built in 1849 over the picturesque River Welland, on this walk we'll stroll through the heart of Stamford under some utterly gorgeous blue skies, as we pass along enchanting, undulating streets and alleys, and take in sights including a number of soaring medieval churches, the site of the historic Stamford Castle, and so much more. But if there's one thing that truly defines Stamford, it's the town's collection of centuries-old cream-coloured stone buildings, just a couple of which we can see here on St Mary's Hill. The grand building across the road from us now is Stamford's elegant town hall, which was built back in 1779 as the new home for the town council, replacing an older medieval town hall which actually stood on top of the town bridge a few yards back down the street. That original bridge-borne town hall was demolished in the late 18th century to improve traffic flow into the town centre, and its gorgeous replacement served as the town council's home for nearly 200 years. After the council moved out in 1974, the building became a magistrates' court, but today it's an exquisite civic venue, and home to a variety of important artefacts which detail Stamford's illustrious history. While much of the town as we see it today dates from the 17th and 18th centuries, Stamford's history goes all the way back to the Roman era, and we'll talk about the town's development over the last 2,000 years as we make our way around Stamford. But at the top of St Mary's Hill now, we find ourselves in the shadow of none other than the beautiful St Mary's Church. One of the oldest buildings in Stamford, St Mary's here was originally built back in the 12th century, and it's today dominated by a majestic tower and spire, which were built in the 13th and 14th centuries respectively. For much of history, the tower and spire have stood as one of the most prominent landmarks in Stamford, visible for miles around for those coming to the town in the medieval era, although the church spire was narrowly saved from collapse in the 1740s, one of the many features of the church that have been restored through its more than 800 years of history. The fetching stony porch here, meanwhile, is roughly 600 years old, dating from the 15th century, and it's one of many atmospheric Gothic elements that make St Mary's one of the most striking landmarks in Stamford. There are plenty more spectacular buildings for us to see on our walk around Stamford, but as we now look down St Mary's Hill towards the bridge on the River Welland, if you're already itching to visit this beautiful stone town, you might like to know exactly where Stamford is located on a map. As we mentioned, Stamford lies in England's East Midlands, on the very southern tip of the county of Lincolnshire, and is situated just under 15 miles northwest of Peterborough and 30 miles east of the largest city in the region, Leicester. There's a wealth of historic towns to be found in the area surrounding Stamford, but there are few which combine heritage with beauty quite like this place. But as we stroll around the perimeter of St Mary's Church, why exactly did Stamford, today a famous but by no means huge town of around 20,000 people, emerge as one of the largest and most important settlements in medieval England? Well, in its early history, over 2,000 years ago, Stamford benefited from fortunate local geography, located at a point on the River Welland which was easy to ford, the origin for the settlement's name, Stamford, which means stony ford. That ford, located just to the east of the modern town bridge, would actually remain one of the most important crossing points of the Welland all the way until 1960, as it formed part of the historic Great North Road, which passed right through Stamford's town centre here, and which gave birth to many historic coaching inns like the Stamford Vaults across the road from us here. The Great North Road, which ran for hundreds of miles linking London with Edinburgh, was of vital importance to Stamford through the centuries, and we'll talk more about it later on. But we now find ourselves on St Mary's Street, which didn't form part of the historic highway, but which is home to yet more of Stamford's many historic stone buildings. Spinning around, across the road from us we can see the modern Stamford Arts Centre, and along from it Stamford Theatre. The Arts Centre is housed in a building dating to the 1720s, built as the town's assembly rooms, and which is actually home to the oldest surviving ballroom in Britain, while the theatre beside it dates from the late 1760s, when it was said to have been the best new theatre in the kingdom. The two cultural venues were built just one road over from Stamford's busy High Street, which we'll visit in a couple of minutes, and where we'll see the town's thriving market in action. But while the High Street may be the centre of life in Stamford, here we find a rather calmer area known as St George's Square, home to an array of gorgeous Georgian-era houses built around the Church of St George, another of Stamford's oldest buildings. Originally founded back in the 12th century, the church as we see it today features, at its oldest, stonework from the 13th century, when it was built just a few steps away from the larger St Mary's Church to cater to the growing number of worshippers in medieval Stamford. As we mentioned, Stamford was one of the largest towns in England in the Middle Ages, and that's why you'll find no less than 7 medieval churches packed onto the streets of this rather compact town centre. But as well as its sizable medieval population, the high density of historic churches in the town centre came about as a result of the fact that Stamford was for centuries surrounded by a ring of large defensive walls, which limited the town's spread over time. Now very little of those old walls remain today, but their history goes back around 1100 years to the early 10th century, when the first defences were built to surround Stamford on the orders of the Anglo-Saxon King Edward the Elder, after the town had been devastated during the invasion of the region by the Danes. Before those walls were built, Stamford here actually came to be situated on the very southern edge of the Danes' territory in medieval England, a vast area under their control known as the Danelaw. While the Danes had at one point extended their territory as far south as Hampshire in the 9th century, in the 10th century, Stamford, and more specifically the River Welland, became a temporary border between the Danelaw and Anglo-Saxon-dominated England, with the two sides facing each other across the river here. However, the Danes were eventually pushed back, and under Anglo-Saxon control, the newly fortified town of Stamford began to really prosper, home to its own mint which produced currency, and a burgeoning centre of industry, with the town gaining notoriety for its production of pottery and later cloth. Cloth making in particular was a crucial development in Stamford's rise to prominence as one of England's most important medieval towns, and we'll talk more about that later on. But as we pass by the King's Head pub, we're now coming up towards Stamford's High Street, on which we'll find yet another grand medieval church. Founded in the 12th century like St Mary's and St George's, this is the Church of St Michael the Greater, better known simply as St Michael's. Standing beside the main street right in the heart of Stamford's town centre, the medieval St Michael's Church existed for around 700 years, between the 12th century and 1832, when the ageing place of worship infamously collapsed, though it was rebuilt not long after into the form we see today. But despite its central position in the town, St Michael's was never the best attended church in Stamford, and it was closed down in 1962. 20 years later in 1982, part of the former church was converted into shops, which still exist today here on Stamford's lively High Street, where, as you might have spotted, it's market day. Now usually, Stamford's traditional market is held not on the High Street, but on Broad Street and Ironmonger Street, which we'll visit later on. But we're lucky to be here on a day with a double dosing of traditional trade, as the High Street is home to stalls participating in the town's twice-monthly farmers' market. Playing host to stands selling foods from local farms, the farmers' market is just one part of what makes Stamford's markets among the most popular in the East Midlands, visited by people not just from around town, but all over the region. Being carried out in the shadow of the beautiful St Michael's Church, the farmers' market here, held every other Friday, is a continuation of well over 1,000 years of trading that has taken place on Stamford's streets, with the town's first markets having been held all the way back in the Anglo-Saxon era. As a flourishing town under the rule of Edward the Elder, Stamford's market initially grew as a place where general goods and livestock were traded, but as the town's reputation and wealth grew, it became known for the sale of pottery, as we mentioned. These were the first of Stamford's traditional Friday markets, which are still held on Fridays over 1,000 years later today, and the wealth brought in by trade was key in Stamford's rise to prominence as one of England's largest towns. We'll shortly make our way off this central thoroughfare to get a closer look at Stamford's traditional weekly Friday market, but take note of the steep-roofed building on our left. It's one of the oldest secular buildings in use in Stamford today, dating from the 16th century, evident from its rather different appearance to the many stone Georgian houses which line the town's streets. Certainly, it's even older than the rebuilt St Michael's Church here, which has thankfully been retained in the town centre even after its closure in the 60s, standing proudly over the lively High Street and the adjoining Ironmonger Street, which will now make our way up, past yet more of the town's market stalls. Sloping up from the High Street towards Broad Street, Ironmonger Street here of course takes its name from the fact that it was home to a number of ironmongers' workshops. Ironmongers were one of a number of different traders who worked in the shops of central Stamford's main streets by the 18th century. The town also home to watchmakers, saddlers, drapers, printers, butchers, bakers, and a couple of cheesemongers, a variety which points to the prosperity of trade in this town in the Georgian era, when Stamford would have looked almost identical to how it does today. And much like it would have been the case on any Friday back in the 18th century, Ironmonger Street here is still home to stalls belonging to Stamford's sprawling traditional weekly market, where you can buy pretty much anything your heart desires. Stamford's market is particularly good for buying locally produced craft goods and an array of clothing. Not much different then to what the market was known for around 1,000 years ago in the Anglo-Saxon era: pottery and cloth. Coming to the top of Ironmonger Street here, the market stalls spread out even further as we find ourselves on Broad Street, so named because, well, it's rather wide. Now, Broad Street is the traditional home of Stamford's market. The roads are shut to cars on Fridays for the stalls that we see around us, and people flock to the area to peruse what's on offer, as they have been doing for centuries. Stamford's association with pottery began around the late 9th century, when it became the famed home of Stamford ware, some of the earliest glazed ceramics to be produced in post-Roman Britain, and which over the centuries became popular not just around the country, but over in continental Europe as well. The popularity of Stamford ware cemented this town's market as an important and much sought-after place to do business, bringing in wealth and people who brought with them new skills, most notably in the production of a type of woven woolen cloth known as haberdashery. Stamford's cloth then took over from Stamford ware as the town's most famous export until the eventual decline of the local wool trade in the 15th century, about 400 years before this splendid building was opened on Broad Street. This is the Corn Exchange, opened in 1859 as the place where grain was traded in the town, but also it was a venue for many of the town's social and cultural events. As corn exchanges declined in importance, however, the building became a cinema in 1900, and today it's home to another of the town's theatres. Now, the Corn Exchange is actually one of the newer buildings in Stamford's town centre, built in the Victorian era. But on the opposite side of Broad Street here, there stands another of Stamford's oldest landmarks, the 15th century Browne's Hospital. Standing tall behind the market stalls here, Browne's Hospital was a product of Stamford's thriving late medieval wool trade, built in 1475, and founded by the wealthy local wool merchant William Browne. Browne did much to develop Stamford in the 15th century, funding the expansion of the nearby All Saints' Church, and the hospital here, or the bedhouse as it was known, was over the years expanded to improve the care provided to the town's sick, with the addition of almshouses as a place for Stamford's poor to live. A huge complex here on the northern side of the town centre, Browne's Hospital is amazingly still in operation nearly 550 years after it opened, still serving as a registered charity that cares for around a dozen residents who live in Victorian-built cottages behind the building that we can see here. Other parts of the hospital complex, however, have been much restored over the years, and today you can visit many of its old main rooms, and learn more about the history of both the building and William Browne himself. Rather interestingly, Browne, born nearby into a family from Rutland, wasn't just responsible for the development of Stamford here, but he also served for a period as the Lord Mayor of Calais when the now French town was a part of England, and was known as a thriving centre of the wool trade. Now, as we mentioned briefly, Stamford's wool trade, which brought it great wealth in the late medieval era, eventually declined from the late 15th century as the local industry was overtaken by the wool trade in East Anglia. But during the industry's heyday here in Stamford, it brought much more to the town than just wealth. As we pass by the unusually modern Central Cinema, built in 1938, the success of medieval Stamford led it to becoming one of the most powerful towns in England for the period, and home to a number of the nation's most influential institutions. As one of the largest towns in this part of the East Midlands, in 1076, Stamford was appointed as a major centre where legal cases were to be heard. Meanwhile, regular visits to the town by the king heightened Stamford's status even further. National parliaments were held here, and numerous wealthy and influential monasteries were founded around the town in the 13th century. But perhaps most interesting is not the institutions that Stamford had, but one which the town only just missed out on. Now, back in 1086, when the Domesday Book recorded the state of Norman England, Stamford was home to around 2,500 people, one of just 18 towns in the country at the time, with a population of over 2,000. But as we stroll down the narrow Wellington Lane here, one of the other towns of large size at that time was Oxford, which by the year 1096 had become the home of the University of Oxford, the first of its kind in England. Oxford was the only university in England for over 100 years until the year 1209, when 2 students at the university were lynched by locals, an event that outraged many Oxford scholars, who decided to pack up, leave town, and move cross-country to found their own university at Cambridge. Just over a century later, in 1333, meanwhile, yet more unrest in Oxford led a number of students to again pack up, leave town, and move cross-country to found their own university here in Stamford. However, unlike Cambridge, the establishment of which was approved by the king, the creation of the rival University of Stamford was rejected by the king, who then ordered the students to head back to Oxford. But as we look up at the distinctive 16th century Gothic house here on the High Street, today home to a popular local bookshop, had things panned out differently, the University of Stamford here could have been England's 3rd major university, with a status similar to that of Oxford and Cambridge. But the reality was that it lasted for just 2 years, and only 15 students ever attended. Never having the university was very possibly a missed opportunity for Stamford, but even without it, the town star continued to rise. That was until events of the 15th and 16th centuries brought Stamford's centuries of growth to an end. We already know that the decline of the wool trade adversely impacted the town, but Stamford here also suffered heavily during the Wars of the Roses, principally because of its allegiance to the Yorkists, who ultimately lost the conflict. In 1460, the Yorkists' adversaries, the Lancastrians, captured Stamford and burned much of the town, including All Saints' Church, which held many of the town's most important documents and archives inside. We'll take a closer look at All Saints' Church in a moment, but here at the end of the High Street, we find yet another of Stamford's many town centre churches, this being the Church of St John the Baptist. Wedged between a pair of shops in the heart of town, the church's tower dates from the 15th century, somehow having survived the Lancastrians' assaults during the Wars of the Roses, although, like the 3 previous churches we've seen on our walk so far, St John the Baptist's at its oldest features stonework dating to the 12th century. And in true Stamford fashion, if we simply spin around, we'll find, you guessed it, another church. Up in front of us here, we can see the mighty All Saints' Church, by far the largest and arguably the oldest in Stamford today, and which we mentioned was in part burned down during the Wars of the Roses. As we spoke about earlier too, William Browne was responsible for the restoration and expansion of the church following its burning. But while All Saints as we see it now is a work of between the 13th and 18th centuries, a church has stood on this site since the Anglo-Saxon era, over 1,000 years ago. Its soaring spire too has been a historic landmark of Stamford, standing directly over All Saints Street here, which for centuries formed part of the Great North Road. People travelling between north and south would therefore recognise All Saints Church as an important waymarker on their journey along the historic highway, while just a bit further up the road, we can also see a tall chimney that belongs to the local All Saints Brewery, which was opened back in 1825. Now the brewery, which still operates today, links into the story of how Stamford, devastated by the Wars of the Roses and the later closure of its monasteries in the 16th century, rose again into what we now know as the finest stone town in Britain. The Great North Road, which was historically the road beside us here, brought regular passing trade through the heart of Stamford, and as the centuries went by and people began moving around the country more often, this town really began to boom again. Now Stamford had always been an important halting point for those travelling through England. Kings and queens in particular would stop in the town while touring their kingdom. But from the 17th century onwards, more and more people began travelling long distances, and the birth of turnpike roads, funded by tolls, improved the quality of the streets people were journeying along. As a result of this large growth in travel, the centre of Stamford soon became home to a wide variety of coaching inns, taverns where weary voyagers could rest while on their long journeys up and down the country. Earlier on in our walk, we passed by the Stamford Vaults, one of the many coaching inns that profited hugely with the growing importance of the Great North Road. But perhaps the most famous of Stamford's inns was a tavern known as the Red Lion. The Red Lion, which lends its name to this, Red Lion Square, historically stood here beside the Great North Road, serving travellers for centuries, since it was established around the 14th century until it closed down around 1720. By the time of the Red Lion's closure, Stamford was regaining much of the affluence it had lost in the previous centuries, once again becoming a bustling place of all kinds of trades, and this square was known as the home of the town's White Meat Market. The White Meat Market ceased long ago, although Red Lion Square later became home to a number of butchers' shops in an area of town which was always busy with livestock. Heading off Red Lion Square, we're going to walk from the site of the old White Meat Market towards Sheepmarket, along this winding alleyway named Horseshoe Lane. This is one of the last of what were once many medieval alleyways remaining in Stamford today, and as the name suggests, it was the place where a number of Stamford's farriers worked, producing horseshoes. At the bottom of Horseshoe Lane, meanwhile, we find ourselves on the square known as Sheepmarket, named, as you'd imagine, because it was once the site of the town's sheep market. At the heart of it, though, there stands a striking monument to an important moment in royal history. In 1290, Queen Eleanor of Castile, the beloved wife of King Edward I, died near the city of Lincoln, roughly 40 miles to the north of here. Now, upon her death, the Queen's body had to be transported back to London for her funeral at Westminster Abbey, and so there began a historic procession through the country towards London, which stopped overnight at 12 locations along the route from Lincoln. One of those locations was right here in Stamford, where the king and his wife's coffin likely rested for 2 nights, and in memory of the occasion, Edward constructed a so-called Eleanor cross in Stamford, which is thought to have stood just to the north of the modern town centre. In total, there were 12 Eleanor crosses built for each stoppage during the funeral procession, although only 3 remain today, Stamford's having fallen into decay and removed back in the 17th century. There are fragments of Stamford's old Eleanor cross still on display at the town's library, but the striking sculpture that we see on Sheepmarket here was built in 2009 to more publicly commemorate the presence of the original medieval cross. Now, we're going to make our way off Sheepmarket down towards the River Welland, where we'll be ending our walk looking towards the town bridge in just over 5 minutes' time. Of course, nowadays, the town of Stamford spans both sides of the River Welland, but when Stamford was surrounded by defensive walls, the river marked the boundary of the flourishing medieval town. As we mentioned earlier, the first defences built around Stamford were the work of the Anglo-Saxon King Edward the Elder in the 10th century, but these were replaced in the mid-12th century, under the reign of the Norman King Stephen. Now those walls, which were in part damaged during the Wars of the Roses, were later demolished almost entirely, but one defensive element that does remain clearly visible today are the ruins of Stamford Castle, built around the year 1075. Once a sprawling fortress situated beside the river, here we can see the last remains of Stamford Castle, these arches, which likely date to the 14th century, having belonged to the castle's Great Hall. The Great Hall was the place for grand banquets and events at Stamford Castle, But by the time that these arches were built, the castle had begun to decline in importance, eventually falling into total disuse by the year 1340. The site of the former castle was then built on numerous times through the centuries. But why exactly was the fortress built in the first place? Well, Stamford Castle was initially built under the reign of William the Conqueror, as a way for the Normans, who had recently invaded England, to keep control over the important crossing of the River Welland here. Now, until development of the 1930s, when the town's bus station was built on the site, you would have been able to clearly see the prominent Motte and Bailey layout of the Norman-era castle, which saw regular conflict in the centuries that it was in use. Most interestingly, in the mid-12th century, the fallout from the Civil War known as the Anarchy saw Stamford's castle unusually pitted against the rest of the town, the castle having supported the newly crowned King Henry II, and the townspeople having backed the Earl of Chester, who was laying claim to the throne. This ended in a situation where the people of Stamford actually laid siege to their own castle, and they won, although within a couple of decades the castle was back in the monarchy's hands again. Though the castle is long gone, the area around it remains much the same as it once did. Further along the road from here you'll find the King's Mill, a historic watermill that stands beside this small waterway, a stream that was used to power the mill, and which is separated from the River Welland by a large island known as the Meadows. Now, this stream and the original King's Mill were certainly in existence by the 13th century, and the mill took its name from King John. But here, we're now walking onto the Meadows, a beautiful expanse of common land that serves as a popular town park in the middle of the river. Offering some lovely views of both the river and the rest of the town, the Meadows stands roughly where the original Stony Ford existed, although that wasn't the only major ford to have existed in this area. In fact, while the Stony Ford here was used by both Celtic Britons over 2,000 years ago, and then the Anglo-Saxons around 1,000 years ago, the Romans used a different ford a little further upstream, which formed part of their cross-country Roman road, known as Ironmonger Street, which ran for nearly 200 miles and links London to Lincoln. The Romans are thought to have had two military camps a few miles either side of their ford on the Welland, and they chose to cross the river near Stamford, as this is the lowest point of the river where it could be feasibly forded. As we know well, fords and river crossings have been of vital importance to Stamford throughout the town's history, so much so that the place is named after a ford. Nowadays, the River Welland is only crossed by the town bridge, where we started our walk, and which stands just a few yards downstream from the edge of the Meadows here, having originally been built at least by the late 11th century, finally meaning those arriving into Stamford could do so with dry feet. There have been a number of bridges across the Welland where the town bridge stands today, though it's always been a bit of a bottleneck for traffic entering Stamford, especially before the late 18th century, when a gateway and toll booth stood at the end of the bridge, slowing traffic passing up the Great North Road. Here on the Meadows in the middle of the River Welland, though, we're coming to the end of our walk around the beautiful, fascinating town of Stamford. Home to a gorgeous array of stone buildings and a wealth of highly significant historic landmarks, Stamford is an utter joy to visit, no less beautiful than Bath and no less enthralling than Edinburgh. Once upon a time one of England's most important, most influential and largest towns, Stamford is full of history, and I really hope you've enjoyed it as we've strolled through the centuries on this walk around the town today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to visiting Stamford for yourself sometime soon.